Imagine a house with only one mirror, and in it a mother is kneeling on the floor, holding her daughter's foot in both hands, the way you might hold something breakable. On the low table beside her, a bowl of warm water, a coil of white cotton bandage, and a small pair of scissors. The girl is 7 years old. She has just finished her rice porridge. In a few minutes, her mother is going to break her toes, one by one, and bend them under the sole of her foot. And she is going to do it gently, because she loves her. For almost 1,000 years, this was not cruelty in the way we'd use that word today. It was preparation. It was a mother's duty. In some households, it was even considered an act of tenderness, because the alternative, everyone believed, was a daughter who would never marry, never be provided for, never be safe. Hi friends. Tonight, we're going somewhere quiet and far away, into the inner rooms of old China, where the candles burned low, where the courtyards were swept clean every morning, and where an entire civilization once agreed, generation after generation, that a woman's worth could be measured in inches of bent bone. Before we begin, take a moment for yourself. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Pull your blanket up over your shoulders. Let your eyes get heavy. There's nothing you need to do tonight except listen and drift. Whenever you're ready, let's begin. You would have grown up hearing the phrase before you ever understood it. Sankun Jin Lian, 3-inch golden lotus. It was said the way you might say a compliment or a prayer. Grandmothers said it to granddaughters. Matchmakers said it to mothers. It floated through the house the way the smell of wood smoke did. So constant you stopped, noticing it was there at all. The practice is thought to have taken root more than 1,000 years ago, sometime in the era of the Song dynasty courts, when dancers at the imperial court were said to bind their feet into the shape of a crescent moon to perform a kind of dance no one alive today has ever seen. It was elegant, it was rare, and like most things that begin as rare and elegant, it slowly, quietly became mandatory. By the time our girl in the Golden Lotus era is born, let's say, into a modest merchant family in a provincial town, somewhere along a slow brown river, the practice is no longer about dancers. It is about marriage. It is about food on the table. It is about whether her family will be spoken with respect in the marketplace, or with the particular, cutting pity reserved for a household with an unmarriageable daughter. You can hear the town before you can see it. Wooden cartwheels on packed earth. A rooster 3 streets over, confused about the hour. Somewhere, a broom against stone steps. Someone's mother, sweeping the same 6 steps she has swept every morning for 20 years, because a clean threshold is a small, quiet form of dignity when you don't have much else. In this house, there are 3 daughters and 1 son, and the son eats first. This is simply how it is. Nobody in the house would think to write it down as unfair, any more than you would write down that water is wet. It is the shape of things. The mother, who is perhaps 32 years old but looks older, the way most mothers of that century did, has already decided, long before her daughters could walk, which of them would be beautiful enough, obedient enough, marriageable enough to be worth the trouble of binding, because, and this is the part that's easy to forget, tucked in among all the pain, foot binding cost something. It cost time. Cheap cotton bandages could be bought, but they had to be re-washed, re-dried, rewound every 2 or 3 days for years. It cost the mother's own labor, because in a poor household, the girl whose feet were bound could not walk far, could not fetch water, could not work the same long field hours as her sisters. A bound-foot daughter was, in a strange and quietly devastating way, a luxury, a signal to the neighborhood that this family could afford to have one daughter who didn't have to walk. You start to understand, then, why a mother might do this with her own 2 hands and call it love. Soft creak of a floorboard, a kettle beginning to sing somewhere in another room. The morning it begins is not dramatic. There is no ceremony, no gathered relatives, no priest. It usually happens between the ages of 4 and 9. Young enough that the bones of the foot are still soft as green wood. Old enough that the girl can understand, at least a little, that this is happening to her and that it is meant to help her. The mother, or sometimes a grandmother, an aunt, a woman in the village known for having a steady hand, begins by soaking the girl's feet in a warm basin. Sometimes the water has herbs in it, sometimes animal blood, sometimes alum, sometimes crushed rock. The purpose, they believed, was to soften the skin, to numb the foot slightly, to make what comes next a little more bearable. It rarely was. Then, one by one, the toes are folded under the sole of the foot, all except the big toe, which stays pointing forward, because it's the big toe that will eventually become the very front tip of the new, small shape. The other 4 toes are pressed down, curled beneath the arch, tucked under like a hand folding into a fist. And then the foot is wrapped. Long strips of cotton bandage, wound again and again, each layer pulling the toes a little further under, the heel a little closer to where the toes now sit. You can imagine the sound of the cloth, that dry, papery rustle of cotton being pulled taut, over and over, the way you might imagine wrapping a gift, except the gift is a foot, and the foot is your daughter's, and you are the one doing the wrapping. The girl cries. Almost always, she cries. The historical accounts, and there are many, because this practice lasted so long that eventually women themselves began writing about it, quietly, in old age, describe the first weeks as the worst. The pain of walking on newly bound feet was described by some survivors as feeling like walking on broken glass every single step, which, in a very literal sense, it was. The arch of the foot really was being broken, not once, but slowly over months as the bandages were tightened week by week, forcing the foot to fold in on itself until it took on the shape everyone had agreed was beautiful. Small, curved, pointed, no longer than about 4 inches in the most extreme cases, though most bound feet ended up closer to 5 or 6. A distant temple bell, unhurried, 3 slow tones. Here is something almost nobody expects to hear. On a night like this, the girls were often told to walk. Not rest, walk. Walking on the newly bound foot, painful as it was believed to help the bones set into their new shape faster, and to keep the foot from swelling so badly that infection set in. So the very thing that hurt the most was also, according to the logic of the time, the thing that was supposed to help. Mothers would make their daughters pace slowly around the courtyard, back and forth, wincing with every step, because standing still for too long was considered worse for the foot than moving. You have to picture it gently, if you can, not as horror, but as a kind of grim domestic routine, the way you might picture a mother forcing a reluctant child to finish their vegetables, except stretched out over years and involving actual broken bone. The two things sat right next to each other in that house. Ordinary tenderness and quiet sanctioned harm. The same hands that combed the girl's hair each night were the hands that rewrapped her feet each morning. Infection was common, almost expected. Toenails sometimes had to be removed entirely, to stop them digging into the folded, tucked under toes beneath them. Circulation to the foot was reduced, which is part of why the foot eventually stopped growing at all, freezing in that small curved shape for the rest of the woman's life. Some girls lost toes altogether to infection or gangrene. Historians who later interviewed elderly women who had survived the process, some of the last living women with bound feet, interviewed in the late 20th century, already in their 80s and 90s, described mothers who wept while doing the binding, who bound their daughters' feet at night so the crying wouldn't wake the neighbors, who told their daughters, again and again, in the same soft, apologetic voice, "This will help you. This is for your future. I am sorry. This will help you." The kettle, still on the fire somewhere, a thin whistle rising and falling. It's worth pausing here on something almost funny, in the dry, sad way old customs often are. Matchmakers of the era were known to judge a bride's worth partly by the smallness and shape of her bound foot, sometimes even before they judged her face. A go-between might visit a household, ask to see the girl's feet through a gap in a curtain, and leave without ever once looking at her expression. You could be plain, even in that era's own terms, and still be considered a wonderful match. If your feet were small enough, and your walk had that particular swaying gait bound feet produced, a gait some poets of the time compared to a willow branch swaying in wind. It is a strange kind of compliment when you sit with it long enough, an entire aesthetic built not around a face, but around a wound, and yet, and this is the part that makes the whole custom so difficult to simply condemn from a distance. The mothers doing this were not monsters in their own eyes, or in their neighbors' eyes. They were doing what their own mothers had done to them. They had walked on bound feet their whole lives, had learned to accept the ache as simply what a foot felt like, the way you might accept a certain stiffness in your knees as you got older. When they bound their daughters' feet, they were often doing the only thing they knew how to do, to keep that daughter fed, married, and safe inside a system none of them had built and none of them could unbuild alone. The girl in our story, let's imagine her name is Mei Ying, meaning beautiful shadow, finishes her first full binding season roughly 8 weeks after it began. Her feet are wrapped now in their permanent shape, small and curled, tender still, but no longer actively being reshaped week by week. She will rewrap them herself every single day for the rest of her life. She will learn to walk again, slowly in a shuffling, careful gait that will carry her from childhood into old age. She will never run again. She will never again feel flat, solid ground beneath a full, unbroken foot. Tonight, in our story, she sits by the window as the last light fades from the courtyard, her small bound feet tucked beneath her on the low stool, still tender, still healing, still hers. Silence, but a warm one, the kind that settles over a house at dusk. But there was one thing about bound feet that almost nobody outside the women's quarters ever knew. A small, private world of embroidered shoes, secret songs, and a language written only by women, passed foot to foot, generation to generation, that even most husbands never learned existed. Somewhere in a rural county of Hunan province, generations of women passed down a form of writing that no man could read. Not because it was hidden in a locked box, but because no man had ever bothered to learn it. It was stitched into the paper fans they carried, folded into the handkerchiefs they gave one another at weddings, and sung, quietly, into the small embroidered shoes that covered their bound feet. Husbands walked past this secret language every single day of their married lives, and never once suspected it was there. That secret language had a name, Nushu, women's writing, and it grew, in part, from the very same rooms where the binding happened. Hi again, friends. If you're still here with me, settle back in. Let your shoulders drop from your ears. Tonight's story keeps unfolding gently, thread by thread, the way it always does. When Mei Ying's feet finally healed into their permanent shape, something shifted in her daily life that nobody had quite prepared her for. She could no longer run through the courtyard chasing her younger cousins. She could no longer climb the low garden wall to steal plums from the neighbor's tree the way she had the summer before. But she found, almost by accident, that she now had time, long, quiet, unhurried hours, because a girl who could not walk far could not be sent to the well, or the market, or the far fields. She was, in a sense, the household understood without ever saying aloud, confined to the inner rooms. And the inner rooms, it turned out, were where the real education happened. The soft click of wooden bobbins, thread pulled through cloth. You have to picture the women's quarters as their own small country, tucked inside the larger country of the house, which was tucked inside the larger country of the empire. In here, mothers taught daughters embroidery, not as a hobby, but as a survival skill, since a well-embroidered shoe could raise a family status in a matchmaker's eyes almost as much as the foot itself. Aunts taught nieces which herbs eased foot pain at night. Grandmothers, the oldest women in the house, the ones whose feet had been bound so long ago they could barely remember the sound of their own unhindered footsteps, told stories. Some of those stories, in certain regions, were not spoken at all, but written, in a script found nowhere else in the world, invented by women for women, built from thin, elegant, slanting strokes that looked almost like insects resting on a page. Historians who studied Nushu later believed it may have developed over centuries, specifically because girls, unlike their brothers, were rarely taught the standard written Chinese characters used by scholars and officials. Denied one language, the women quietly built another. They wrote messages of comfort to new brides moving away to unfamiliar households. They wrote grief when a friend died young, which happened often in a world with so little medicine. They wrote small jokes about their mothers-in-law, tucked into the corner of an otherwise formal letter, dry and sharp, in a way that would have surprised anyone who assumed these women spent their confined lives only weeping. Because here is something worth sitting with for a moment. These women were not simply victims sitting quietly in pain, though there was plenty of pain. They built entire friendships out of this shared confinement. Some formed what were called sworn sisterhoods, pairs or small groups of women, often bound together for life in a bond considered almost as significant as marriage, who wrote to each other in Nushu across the whole span of their lives, sharing worries, celebrating small victories, complaining, quietly, about their husbands' mothers, the way friends anywhere might complain about a difficult in-law over tea. A soft laugh, imagined, light, dry, the kind shared between old friends. It's a small, strange comfort, isn't it? To learn that inside a custom built almost entirely around controlling women's bodies, women found a way to build something that was entirely privately their own. Maying, in our story, is taught her letters by her grandmother, an old woman named Shu Ying, whose bound feet by now are so small and so brittle that she rarely leaves her chair by the window. Shu Ying's hands, though, are steady and sure, even at 70, and she guides her granddaughter's fingers across the thin strokes of the secret script, tracing them again and again on cheap paper until Maying can write her own name. "Your feet will hurt less than mine did," Shu Ying tells her. One afternoon, in that dry, matter-of-fact tone old women in every century seem to share. "I was bound at 4, you were bound at 7. Every generation we get a little more sense. Perhaps by your granddaughter's time, they'll simply write a poem about it instead." It's a joke, and a strange one, and also, if you think about it for more than a moment, almost unbearably sad. An old woman making light of generational trauma, because the alternative, sitting with it directly, is simply too heavy for an ordinary afternoon. Wind against a paper window screen, a soft rattling hush. The shoes themselves deserve their own quiet mention here, because so much of a bound-foot woman's inner life was, quite literally, stitched into them. A pair of shoes for a bound foot was tiny, barely the length of your palm, and yet extraordinarily labor-intensive to make. Silk uppers, embroidered with peonies, butterflies, or bats, which in the symbolic language of the time stood for good fortune. Layers of stiff cotton or paper soles, sometimes built up with a slight wedge to help the woman balance on her curved, unsteady feet. A skilled woman might spend weeks on a single pair, and a bride was expected to arrive at her new husband's home with dozens of pairs, sometimes over 100, all made by her own hands, as proof of both her modesty and her diligence. Think about that for a moment. An entire trousseau of shoes, each one a tiny private artwork, made by candlelight, over months, by a girl who could barely walk to the well and back. The shoes were, in a way, the one part of this whole custom where a woman's skill, patience, and taste could actually shine, could actually be admired on its own terms, even though the reason the shoes needed to exist at all was a wound. There's a strange, gentle irony folded into all of this, the way there so often is in old customs once you sit with them long enough. The same small foot that caused a lifetime of pain also became, for many women, the one part of themselves they had almost total creative control over. They could not choose their husbands. They could not choose whether to leave the house. But they could choose whether their shoes were embroidered with plum blossoms or chrysanthemums, whether the silk was pale green or deep red, whether the stitching along the sole spelled out, in tiny secret Nushu characters, a private joke only her sworn sister would ever recognize. A distant rooster again, further away now, the sound of evening settling in. Maying grows into a young woman in this slow layered world, half pain, half quiet craft, half confinement, half secret sisterhood. By the time she's 14, her feet have long since stopped hurting in the sharp daily way they did as a child. They ache in the cold and swell a little in humid weather, and she has long since forgotten what it felt like to stand flat and unhindered on open ground. She has, instead, 6 pairs of embroidered shoes she made herself, a small collection of Nushu letters tucked inside a lacquered box, and a sworn sister 3 villages over named Fenghua, whom she has met exactly twice in her life and written to more than 200 times. It is around this age, in households like Mei Ying's, that a very different kind of visitor begins arriving at the door, a woman older still, dressed a little more finely than the neighbors, carrying a small folded paper and an unhurried, appraising manner. The matchmaker, the creak of a gate opening, unhurried footsteps on the path, still small, still hers, still healing in the quiet way old wounds heal. Mei Ying's world is about to widen and narrow all at once the moment that gate creaks open. But what the matchmaker was really there to judge, before she ever looked at Mei Ying's face, was something far stranger than beauty. A walk, a particular sway of the hips that an entire empire had somehow decided was the single most desirable thing a woman could possess. An entire empire, for the better part of 1,000 years, decided that the most desirable thing a woman could do was struggle to walk, not glide, not stride confidently across a room. Struggle, a small, swaying, off-balance shuffle, hips tilting gently side to side to compensate for feet that could no longer support a normal stance. They called it the lotus gait, and poets wrote about it the way poets elsewhere wrote about a woman's eyes or her voice. Hi again, friends. If you drifted a little during the last section, that's all right, welcome back. Nothing here needs to be followed closely, just let the sound of it carry you. The matchmaker who arrived at Mei Ying's gate that afternoon was named old Mrs. Tan, and she had, by that point in her career, arranged something like 400 marriages across 3 counties. She did not sit down right away. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching Mei Ying cross the courtyard to greet her, not looking at her face at all, at first, but at her feet, and the particular tilt of her walk. This was not rude by the standards of the time. It was simply the job. The soft shuffle of small steps on packed earth unhurried. The lotus gait was believed, in a piece of folk medical thinking that traveled almost unquestioned for centuries, to strengthen certain intimate muscles through the constant subtle shifting of the hips and thighs required to keep balance on a bound foot. Whether or not there was any truth in that belief, and most modern historians are skeptical, it hardly mattered. The belief itself was powerful enough to shape an empire's taste. A confident, flat-footed stride came to be seen as almost vulgar, too much like a servant, too much like a woman who worked the fields, too much like a woman with nothing to protect. Old Mrs. Tan watched Mei Ying cross perhaps 12 feet of courtyard, and by the time the girl reached her, had already begun composing, in her head, the letter she'd send to a household 2 towns over. A family with a modestly prosperous grain business, and a son of marrying age, who Mrs. Tan happened to know, had specifically asked for a bride with a walk like a willow in wind. It is worth pausing here, gently, on how strange it is that an entire negotiation over a young person's future, her home for the rest of her life, the family she would belong to, the mother-in-law she would answer to for decades, often hinged on 12 feet of courtyard and the particular sway of her hips. A paper fan, opened with a soft snap, gently waved. Mrs. Tan sat with Mei Ying's mother for tea that afternoon, and the conversation that followed would have sounded, to modern ears, almost comically businesslike for something so enormous. There was talk of the bride price, money and goods the groom's family would pay to Mei Ying's family, partly compensation for the labor they were losing, partly a signal of the family's respectability. There was talk of Mei Ying's dowry, the shoes she'd made, the linens she'd embroidered, whatever silver or land her family could spare. There was talk of the groom's family's reputation in the grain trade, and whether the mother-in-law-to-be was known to be a difficult woman or a fair one. A piece of information gathered quietly, over months, through servants and neighbors, and other matchmakers, the way you might research a company today before accepting a job offer. Mei Ying herself was not in the room for most of this. She would meet her future husband, in many households of this era, for the very first time on her wedding day. distant firecrackers, muffled, a wedding somewhere else in the county. It's tempting to imagine this moment. A young woman handed a stranger's name and told, "This is now your life," as one of pure dread, and for many women it likely was, at least at first. But the historical record, patchy as it is, also holds something gentler and more complicated. Many marriages arranged this way settled, over months and years, into real partnerships, even real affection, the way two strangers thrown together by circumstance sometimes do find their footing with each other. Mei Ying's own mother had married a man she'd met for the first time at her wedding, and 30 years later still kept, tucked inside her sewing box, a small carved comb he'd given her during their first year together. Not because tradition required it, but because she'd simply wanted to keep it. The wedding day itself, for a woman with bound feet, brought its own particular strangeness. Custom in many regions dictated that the bride not walk into her new husband's home at all, but be carried, in a red lacquered sedan chair, curtained and enclosed, borne on the shoulders of hired men through the streets, while musicians played and firecrackers cracked overhead to frighten away bad luck. In a strange way, the very feature that had made her desirable, the small, precious, useless for walking foot, meant that on the single most important day of her life, she barely touched the ground at all. The creak and sway of a sedan chair, muffled music growing closer. Inside the chair, Mei Ying, in our story, is 16 years old, wearing red silk, her small embroidered wedding shoes, the finest pair of the dozens she made herself, hidden beneath layers of skirt. She cannot see out. She can only hear the firecrackers, the flute, the murmur of a crowd she cannot make out individual voices from. And beneath all of it, her own heartbeat, loud in her own ears, the way anyone's heart pounds on the last ordinary morning before an entirely different life begins. She will not see her new home until the chair sets down and the curtain is pulled back. Life afterwards settled into its own long, quiet rhythm. The rhythm most bound-foot women's adult lives eventually found, whatever the anxious wedding day had felt like. Mei Ying's days were shaped, in large part, by what her feet could and couldn't do. She could not carry heavy loads across long distances, so household tasks like carrying water became her mother-in-law's or the household servant's responsibility instead. She could sit for hours doing needlework, keeping accounts, supervising a kitchen, teaching young children their characters, tasks the household considered fitting for a woman whose feet marked her as belonging indoors. The soft click of an abacus, numbers being tallied in a quiet room. There's a dry, almost funny truth buried in this arrangement. If you sit with it long enough, bound feet, originally a marker of a family's ability to afford an idle daughter, became, in adult married life, a genuine limitation on physical labor, which meant a bound-foot wife who managed a household's accounts, servants, and daily logistics was, in her own quiet way, running a small operation, even if nobody in the house would have used that word for it. Mei Yang, by her late 20s, effectively managed her husband's grain accounts during the busy autumn season, adding columns of numbers by lamplight, while her husband negotiated prices at the market. Work that required a sharp mind and steady hands, neither of which had anything to do with the size of her feet, though nobody in the household would have said that part aloud either. Pain, though, never fully left. It simply changed shape. The sharp, active pain of childhood binding gave way, over decades, to a duller, chronic ache, joints that stiffened in cold weather, feet that swelled after long days sitting in one position, a permanent unsteadiness on stairs or uneven ground that meant older bound-foot women were often seen leaning gently on a wall, a door frame, a servant's arm, whatever was nearby. Historians who interviewed the last surviving bound-foot women in rural China during the late 20th century, women by then in their 80s and 90s, some of the very last living witnesses to a 1,000-year-old custom, described a shared matter-of-fact acceptance of this lifelong discomfort that was almost more striking than the pain itself. It was simply what their bodies had always felt like. They knew no other way to stand, wind through bare winter branches, the soft settling of a house at night. Mai Ying, imagined now in her 50s, sits by a different window than the one she sat by as a girl. A window in her husband's family home, decades into a marriage that turned out, in the end, gentler than she'd feared on that first curtained ride in the sedan chair. Her own daughter, grown now, has feet that were never bound at all. Because by the time that daughter was 7 years old, something had begun changing in the wider world outside their quiet provincial town. Something Mei Ying herself could barely explain to her own mother, who had died still believing, right to the end, that she'd done the right thing by her granddaughter by insisting and losing that argument. Still tender in the cold months, still careful on stairs, still hers. Mei Ying's feet carried her through an entire lifetime she never chose the shape of. But somewhere out beyond her quiet courtyard, in cities she would never visit, a very different kind of argument was already being fought. One that would, within a single generation, end 1,000 years of this custom almost entirely, and leave women like Mei Ying as living relics of a world that no longer wanted to remember itself this way. By the final years of the 19th century, in cities Mei Ying would never see, a strange new kind of gathering had begun appearing. Rooms full of women, some of them educated abroad, some of them missionaries, some of them simply mothers who had quietly decided they were done, standing up in front of crowds to argue, calmly and firmly, that this 1,000-year-old custom needed to end. They called their organizations natural foot societies, and within a single lifetime they succeeded in doing something almost nothing else in this story's long history had managed. They changed the mind of an entire civilization. Hi again, friends. If you're still with me, drifting closer to sleep now. This is the last part of tonight's story, and it winds down slower than anything before it. There's nothing left to hold on to tightly. Just let it settle over you. The movement against foot binding didn't arrive all at once, the way a law might. It arrived slowly, in overlapping waves, from several directions at once. Christian missionaries, arriving in Chinese port cities through the later part of the 19th century, brought with them a foreign, sometimes clumsy, but genuinely held conviction that the practice was a physical cruelty rather than a beauty custom, and they founded some of the earliest natural foot societies, encouraging Chinese families in mission communities to leave their daughters unbound. Chinese reformers, some of them scholars, who had traveled abroad and returned home, troubled by how differently women's lives were shaped elsewhere, began writing essays and giving public lectures arguing that bound feet were holding the entire nation back. Weakening mothers, they said, weakened the sons those mothers would raise, and a nation could not modernize on broken arches. The rustle of pamphlets being handed out on a busy street, distant voices, someone reading aloud. And underneath both of those forces, quieter and slower but perhaps more powerful than either, was something simpler. Mothers, in growing numbers, across an enormous and varied country, simply beginning to say no, not in grand public speeches, in kitchens, in courtyards, in the same low private voice they'd have once used to explain the binding itself, they now used to refuse it, to a mother-in-law, to a matchmaker, to an old aunt clicking her tongue about how the girl would never find a decent husband now. By 1912, with the fall of the last imperial dynasty and the establishment of a new republic, foot binding was formally banned by the new government, one of thousands of new laws in a country reinventing itself all at once. But laws, as anyone who has ever tried to change a deeply held family custom knows, rarely end a practice on the day they're signed. In quieter, more remote regions, particularly in the countryside far from the reformist cities, the binding of young girls' feet continued in scattered pockets for decades more, carried on by grandmothers who had never stopped believing, even as their own daughters and granddaughters increasingly refused. A soft, weary sigh, an old argument finally being set down. Historians estimate that some of the very last girls to have their feet bound in rural China were born as late as the 1940s, meaning that women who lived with bound feet their entire adult lives were still alive, still walking their small, careful, lifelong walk, well into the 21st century. Researchers visiting remote villages in the 1990s and 2000s found some of the last living survivors, women in their 80s and 90s, some of the final human beings on Earth who could describe, from direct memory, what it felt like as a small child to have their toes folded under their own soul and bound there for the rest of their lives. Many of these women, interviewed gently in their own final years, described complicated feelings that don't resolve into a simple story of pure suffering or pure acceptance. Some spoke with real anger about what had been done to them as children, wishing openly that it had never happened. Others, more resigned, said simply that it was the world they'd been born into, that their mothers had done what mothers did in that century, and that there was no use being bitter about a shape their lives had taken 70 or 80 years earlier. A few, strikingly, said they still felt, even in extreme old age, a quiet private pride in the tiny, embroidered shoes they'd made with their own hands as young women, objects that had outlived almost everyone who once judged them by. A slow, gentle exhale, like a long day finally ending. Let's return, for a moment, gently, to where we began tonight. To that quiet room, the low table, the bowl of warm water, the mother kneeling on the floor, holding her daughter's foot the way you'd hold something breakable. Picture now a different room. Same shape of house, same low table, but 2 generations later. A different mother kneels beside a different daughter, Mei Ying's own granddaughter, let's imagine, a girl of 7. The very age binding traditionally would have begun. The bowl of warm water is still there. But tonight, it's simply for washing tired feet after a long day of running through the courtyard, climbing the garden wall, doing all the ordinary, unremarkable things a 7-year-old's feet are meant to do. The mother dries her daughter's feet with a soft cloth, and there is no cotton bandage waiting beside the bowl at all. Just a blanket, and a bed, and an ordinary, unremarkable night ahead of them both. The sound of a small child's feet, running lightly across a wooden floor, unhindered, still small, still tired, still hers, but hers in an entirely different sense than it was for her great-grandmother. Hers to run with, hers to stand on, flat and whole, on solid ground. That's where we'll leave this story tonight. Not in the pain of where it began, but in the quiet, unremarkable ordinariness of where it finally ended. 1,000 years is an enormous, almost unimaginable stretch of time, and yet it closed, in the end, the way most enormous things close in the lives of ordinary families. Quietly in a small room, with a mother making a different choice than the one made for her. If this story kept you company tonight, and if it feels worth it, you're welcome to like this video or subscribe for more of these slow, quiet histories, but only if it felt worth it. There's no pressure either way. For now, let your eyes stay closed, let your breathing slow. Let the sound of my voice fade into the background, the way a distant bell fades into silence, the way a house finally settles into sleep after a long, long day. Rest well, friends, sleep well.